The tablet screen felt cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from Olivia's hand. She hadn't touched me, but her fingers hovered just millimeters above mine. I watched her gaze shift from the quarterly projections to the paralyzed stillness of my hand. The silence in the conference room grew heavier than the San Francisco fog pressing against the windows. In that suspended second, the data points vanished. I realized with terrifying clarity that our years of sharp-edged rivalry hadn't been about hate at all. It was a different, dangerous kind of voltage. To understand why that silence felt so loud, you have to understand the noise that came before it. We were the two most promising disruptors in the Bay Area's most cutthroat incubator, the Foundry. It was a glass and steel aquarium designed to make you feel exposed, and Olivia thrived in it. She was the venture capital darling, polished, Stanford-educated, wearing tailored blazers that cost more than my first car. She moved through the corridors like she owned the bandwidth, her code clean, her pitches flawless, her funding rounds oversubscribed. Then there was me. I was the anomaly from a Rust Belt town where tech meant fixing the local factory's server. I coded in hoodies that had seen too many late nights and drank coffee that tasted like battery acid because it was cheap. I'd fought for every inch of floor space in this building, scraping by on angel investments and pure, stubborn grit. Our companies were technically different. She was optimizing fintech algorithms. I was building decentralized security protocols. But the industry loved to pit us against each other. The Ice Queen versus the underdog. We were constantly competing for the same press coverage, the same Innovator of the Year awards, the same oxygen. For 3 years, our relationship was a series of cold wars fought over espresso machines and conference room bookings. I'd walk into the shared kitchen, and the air would drop 10 degrees. She'd offer a curt, professional nod, the kind that acknowledges presence without granting respect, and I'd return it with a tight smile. We were perfect enemies, efficient, predictable. This particular Tuesday was supposed to be the culmination of that war. The partners had called a mandatory strategy session for the top-tier founders. The memo called it synergy and scaling, but we all knew it was a cage match to see who would get the lead investment from a visiting megafund. The atmosphere in the building was brittle. You could smell the ozone of overheating servers and desperate ambition. I arrived early, claiming the seat at the head of the long mahogany table, my laptop battered and covered in stickers, sitting defiantly on the polished wood. I wanted to establish territory. But when the glass doors slid open and Olivia walked in, my territorial instinct faltered. She looked devastatingly sharp. She wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. But it was her scent that hit me first, something cool and expensive, like rain on slate, cutting through the stale air of the conference room. She didn't sit opposite me, which would have been the standard combat position. Instead, she pulled out the chair directly to my right. The proximity was an immediate violation of our unwritten treaty. I could hear the rhythmic click of her stylus against her notebook, a sound that usually annoyed me, but today felt strangely hypnotic. "You're in my quadrant," I said, keeping my voice low, eyes fixed on my screen. "Better view of the whiteboard," Olivia replied, her voice smooth, stripped of any apology. "Unless you're worried I'll steal your source code." "You couldn't run my source code," I shot back, the banter automatic. "It requires too much messy human intuition." She turned slightly, and for the first time that morning, I looked directly at her. Usually, her eyes were guarded, calculating risks and returns. But today, up close, I saw a flicker of fatigue behind the mascara, a hairline fracture in the perfect interface. It was disarming. It made her human. "Try me," she said softly. The challenge wasn't professional. It hung in the air, ambiguous and heavy. The other founders began filing in, filling the room with the noise of posturing and jargon, but the bubble of tension around us didn't pop. It hardened. I could feel the heat of her arm inches from mine, a physical static that made the hair on my arms stand up. The meeting hadn't even started, and I was already losing focus on the objective. The rivalry was still there, structured and imposing, but the foundation was shifting. I just didn't know that the collapse would happen so fast, or that I would be the one to trigger the demolition. The workshop was titled Collaborative Disruption, which is just polite corporate shorthand for Argument as a Service. Marcus, the facilitator, paced the front of the room in a vest that cost more than my rent, talking about breaking silos and bleeding-edge synergy. But the real disruption wasn't happening on the whiteboard. It was happening in the 6 inches of empty space between Olivia's elbow and mine. The room was too small for the amount of ego packed into it, and the air conditioning was losing the battle against the collective body heat of 20 founders trying to out-posture each other. When Marcus opened the floor for a debate on user friction versus security protocols, the room naturally pivoted to us. It was the perfect proxy war. Olivia built seamless fintech apps designed to make money move so fast you forgot you spent it. I built security backends designed to treat every login like a potential hostile invasion. Friction is death, Olivia stated, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She didn't look at the room. She looked at her screen, scrolling through data visualizations that looked like modern art. If a user has to think about the security, you've already lost them. The architecture should be invisible. It should feel like magic. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Magic is just deception with better PR, Olivia. If you make it invisible, you make them vulnerable. You're asking for blind trust in a system that's inherently broken. She turned to me then, swiveling her chair with a slow, deliberate grace. The movement brought her knees almost into contact with mine under the table. I didn't pull back. And you're asking for paranoia, she countered, a small, challenging smile playing on her lips. You build fortresses, but nobody wants to live in a bunker. They want a penthouse with a view. A penthouse is useless if the front door is made of paper, I shot back. The banter was familiar. We'd had versions of this argument in press releases for years, but the frequency was different today. It wasn't just intellectual sparring. It was a form of courtship, encoded in technical jargon. We were testing each other's processing speed, looking for latency, probing for weaknesses in the firewall. Every counterpoint she made was sharp, precise, and devastatingly intelligent. I found myself admiring the elegance of her logic, even as I dismantled it. There is something incredibly seductive about a mind that can keep pace with your own. A brain that processes the world at the same high bandwidth. The room faded into the background. The other founders became static noise. It was just us, locked in a feedback loop of challenge and response. I could smell that cool, rain-washed perfume again, sharper now with the heat of the debate. It was distracting, invading my headspace, making it hard to focus on my encryption metaphors. I watched her throat move as she swallowed, the slight flare of her nostrils when she landed a solid verbal jab. You're dangerous when you optimize, Olivia, I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping under the radar of the general conversation. You strip away everything until there's nothing left but the objective. It's ruthless. Efficiency usually is, she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine. Are you intimidated by efficiency? I'm intrigued by the cost of it. That's when I saw it. I had pushed back on a specific vulnerability in her API integration, a technical point, dry and boring to anyone else, and her composure fractured. Just for a microsecond, her thumb, manicured to perfection, began to tap against the side of her stylus. Tap, tap, tap. A nervous rhythm, a glitch in the rendering of the perfect CEO. She wasn't just annoyed, she was affected. My challenge had gotten under her skin, not because I was wrong, but because I was the only one paying close enough attention to see the cracks. That tiny, rhythmic tapping was the most honest thing she'd done all day. It was a signal broadcast on a frequency only I was tuned to receive. "You're tapping," I whispered, leaning in closer, invading her personal quadrant. Her hand froze instantly. The tapping stopped. She looked down at her fingers, then back up at me, her eyes widening slightly. It was a look of genuine surprise, the expression of someone who realizes they've been observed in high definition when they thought they were transmitting in low res. "I don't tap," she said, but her voice lacked its usual absolute certainty. "You do when you're losing the argument," I teased, holding her gaze. The air between us was suddenly thick, charged with a static electricity that had nothing to do with the servers humming in the corner. "I'm not losing," she said, but she didn't pull away. She stayed right there, in the heat of the collision, letting the silence stretch and warp around us. The workshop session ended, Marcus clapping his hands to break the spell. But the adrenaline didn't dissipate. It settled in my chest, heavy and hot. We had just debugged the dynamic, and the results were terrifying. The system wasn't crashing. It was finally coming online. The evening social mixer was a masterclass in performative relaxation. The organizers had transformed the atrium into a networking lounge, which meant they dimmed the lights, opened a top-tier bar, and lit the massive gas fireplace in the center of the room. The air smelled of expensive scotch and desperate ambition. Everyone had traded their blazers for cashmere sweaters that cost more than my monthly burn rate, holding crystal tumblers and laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I stood on the periphery, nursing a bourbon I didn't actually want, watching the ecosystem function. This was where the imposter syndrome usually hit me hardest. It wasn't just that I was a woman in a male-dominated field, or that my company was smaller than theirs. It was the pedigree. These people spoke a language of ski trips to Aspen and summers in the Hamptons. They had safety nets woven from trust funds and legacy admissions. I came from a place where disruption meant the steel mill closing and your dad losing his pension. I came from a Rust Belt town in Ohio, where the sky was permanently gray and the only way out was a Greyhound bus or a football scholarship. I didn't have either. So I built a backdoor using C++ and insomnia. Standing there, surrounded by the golden children of Silicon Valley, I felt that old, familiar chip on my shoulder, hardening into a weapon. "You're analyzing the room like it's a threat vector," a voice said near my ear. I didn't jump. I just turned to find Olivia standing there. She had ditched the severe suit for a silk blouse that looked like liquid silver, catching the firelight in a way that was irritatingly beautiful. She wasn't holding a drink. She was holding court, just by existing. "It is a threat vector," I replied, taking a sip of the bourbon. "Too much ego in an enclosed space. It's a fire hazard." "You're hiding," she observed, stepping closer. She didn't stand opposite me. She stood beside me, both of us looking out at the crowd. "You were the loudest voice in the workshop. And now, you're blending into the drywall. It's an interesting operating system." "I'm not hiding. I'm conserving battery." "No," Olivia said, turning her head to study my profile. Her gaze was clinical but curious, like she was trying to reverse engineer a piece of malware. "You feel like you don't belong here. That's why you attack first. You think if you hit hard enough, nobody will ask to see your credentials." The accuracy of the statement felt like a physical shove. I looked at her, really looked at her. "You want to know my credentials, Olivia? My credentials are that I built my first server from scrap parts I pulled out of a dumpster behind a Radio Shack. I didn't go to Stanford. I went to the library." I took a breath, the bourbon burning my throat. "Where I'm from, you don't launch a startup to change the world or elevate consciousness. You do it because the alternative is working at the fulfillment center until your back gives out. I code like I'm angry because I remember what it feels like to be hungry. Not ambitious hungry, actually hungry. The silence that followed wasn't the competitive silence of the boardroom. It was stunned. I expected her to sneer, to make a joke about pull yourself up narratives, but she didn't. Her expression softened, the polished mask slipping just enough to reveal something wistful underneath. I've never been hungry, she admitted quietly. The confession hung between us, stark and strange. My father was a venture capitalist. My mother was a patent lawyer. I was writing code at 5. I was pitching to investors at 12. I never had to fight for a seat at the table. The table was built for me. The chair was reserved before I was born. She looked down at her hands that had never touched scrap metal or dumpster lids. I have to be perfect because everyone expects it. You have to be perfect because nobody expects anything from you. It's a different kind of weight, isn't it? Yeah, I whispered, the antagonism draining out of me, replaced by a sudden, terrifying empathy. It is. I think I like your source code better, she said. It's messier, but it's stronger. The crowd had thinned out while we talked, the noise fading into the background. It was just us now, standing by the dying fire, the professional distance bridged by a truth neither of us had planned to share. The rivalry was still there, but the frequency had shifted from hostility to fascination. Later, we ended up in Pod 4, a glass-walled cube near the lodge, to finalize our joint notes. It was just us, a single tablet, and the silence of the snow falling outside. The debate started over a submit button on the interface mockup. It's too aggressive, Olivia insisted, her voice tight. She leaned over the tablet, hair shielding her face. You're forcing the user to commit before they feel safe. I'm not forcing them, I argued, leaning in until my shoulder almost brushed hers. I'm giving them clarity. Ambiguity makes people unsafe. They need to know exactly when the transaction executes. Technically, we argued about UX. Actually, we argued about us. The air in the glass cube grew thin and dangerously intimate. It's bad design, she snapped, reaching to swipe the element away. It's necessary friction, I countered. I reached out to stop her swipe. I shouldn't have done it. It was a reflex, but I miscalculated. My hand didn't land on the bezel. It landed on hers. My fingers brushed the back of her hand. It wasn't a grab. It was barely a graze, but the effect was immediate and catastrophic. It felt like sticking a fork into a server rack. A jolt of voltage bypassing my brain, hitting my chest. I should have pulled back. That's the protocol. You apologize, you retreat, you re-establish the firewall. But I didn't. My hand hovered, skin grazing skin, her heat radiating hotter than the tablet. The room went dead silent. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to cut out. The snow outside seemed to stop falling. Olivia froze. She didn't pull away. She didn't breathe. She just stared at the screen, her hand paralyzed beneath the ghost of my touch. I watched her throat work as she swallowed. I saw that nervous tick return, a tiny tremor in her index finger. You're not pulling away, I whispered. The words weren't a question. They were an observation of a system failure. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes were wide, dark, and completely unguarded. In her place was a woman who looked terrified and thrilled in equal measure. I can't, she breathed. The admission hung there, heavy. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever said to me. I moved my hand, sliding it just an inch so my pinky finger hooked over hers. It was a microscopic movement, but it felt like crossing a border without a passport. The contact was electric. Why can't you? I asked, my voice dropping to that low frequency only we seemed to hear. Because, she murmured, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then snapping back to my eyes. Because I don't want to. The air between us thickened, turning into something viscous and sultry. This wasn't rivalry. This wasn't professional respect. This was a magnetic field distorting the room's reality. I could see the pulse jumping in her neck. I could smell that rain and slate perfume, now mixed with the scent of her own sudden heat. I leaned in, just a fraction, a dare. Then don't, I said. Let it crash, Olivia. See what happens when the system breaks. For a second, I thought she was going to lean in too. I thought she was going to close that final, agonizing inch of distance and wreck both our careers right there in Glass Pod 4. Her lips parted. Her breath hitched. The tension was a physical weight pressing against my chest, making my heart hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then, the firewall rebooted. Panic flashed in her eyes, cold, sharp, and sudden. She snatched her hand back like she'd been burned. The sudden loss of contact left my skin feeling cold. I can't do this, she said, her voice trembling. She stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor, a harsh screech that shattered the intimate silence. Olivia. No. She grabbed her laptop, fumbling with the cord. She wouldn't look at me. She couldn't. I have to go. I have emails. I have to go. She fled the room. The polished, unflappable Olivia Reed practically ran out of the glass cube, leaving the door swinging shut behind her. I sat there, alone, in the silence, my hand still resting on the warm tablet screen, my heart racing like a runaway script. The rivalry was dead. Something else had just been born, and it was terrifying. The next morning, the cafeteria was flooded with aggressive alpine sunlight. But the atmosphere at our table was thick enough to choke on. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like the moments before a server crash when the fans are spinning at maximum velocity and the heat is rising critically. Olivia was sitting 3 seats away from me, which, in our usual dynamic, would have been a declaration of war. Today, it was a desperate attempt at containment. She had constructed a fortress around herself. A half-eaten bagel she wasn't touching. A venti coffee she was gripping like a weapon. And a laptop screen angled precisely to block her peripheral vision of me. She was typing furiously, but I knew her rhythm. I'd studied it for 3 years. This wasn't the rhythmic, flowing cadence of her coding. This was staccato, erratic. She was just hitting keys to look busy. She was hiding. For the first time since I'd entered this industry, the imposter syndrome that usually sat on my chest like a concrete block was gone. In its place was something intoxicating. Clarity. I watched the way her shoulders held a rigid tension, the way she refused to look left, and I didn't feel like the underdog from Ohio anymore. I felt like the only person in the room who knew the truth. The Ice Queen wasn't made of ice. She was made of glass, and I was the only one who had seen her shatter. I finished my coffee, stood up, and waited. The moment she closed her laptop, a sharp, definitive snap, I moved. She headed for the exit, walking with that brisk, efficient stride that usually intimidated entire boardrooms. Today, it looked like a retreat. I caught up to her in the long, wood-paneled hallway leading to the breakout rooms. It was empty, the other founders still caffeinating their hangovers back in the dining hall. "That's a fast pace for a Tuesday morning," I called out, my voice echoing slightly against the timber walls. "You're clocking in at a sprint." Olivia didn't stop, but her stride faltered. "I have a scheduled call with my CTO, critical infrastructure update." "You're a terrible liar, Olivia." I lengthened my stride, stepping in front of her to cut off her path. I didn't block her aggressively. I just occupied the space she was trying to move through. Your CTO is in London. It's 6 p.m. there. He's at the pub. She stopped then, forced to look at me. The composure was back in place, but it was thin, like a layer of frost on a windshield. I have other team members. I don't have time for this, whatever this is. This, I said, leaning against the wall and letting a slow smile spread across my face, is you running a background process to avoid dealing with the glitch from last night. There was no glitch, she snapped, but her eyes darted to my hands, then quickly back to my face. The reaction was involuntary, a biological tell she couldn't code out of her system. I was tired. It was a long day. You're reading data that isn't there. I'm reading the data exactly as it was presented, I countered, keeping my voice low, dropping it into that intimate register that I knew affected her. You're retreating, Olivia. It's not a very bold strategy for a disruptor. I am not retreating, she hissed, stepping closer. The anger was there, but it wasn't the cold, dismissive anger of our past. It was hot. It was flustered. She was fighting for control, and she was losing. I am prioritizing my focus. You are a distraction. A distraction? I pushed off the wall, closing the distance until I was just inside her personal zone again. The scent of rain and slate washed over me. Is that what I am? Yes, she breathed. She didn't back up. Good. I held her gaze, unflinching. Because when you're distracted, you stop calculating for a second. And when you stop calculating, I see the brilliance underneath the script. Yesterday, when you were arguing about the API architecture, it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You weren't just smart, Olivia. You were incandescent. The compliment landed like a physical caress. Her mouth opened slightly, a sharp intake of breath. She had expected mockery, or a challenge, or a proposition. She hadn't expected to be seen. Her eyes searched mine, wide and stunned, the hostility melting into a raw, confused yearning. You, she started, her voice trembling. Attention, disruptors! Marcus's voice boomed from the end of the hallway, shattering the moment like a dropped mirror. We both jumped back, the spell breaking violently. Change of plans! The investors want to see how you handle pressure. We're doing a 24-hour pair programming sprint. Mandatory participation. Fate, or perhaps a sadistic algorithm designed by Marcus, intervened. When he read the list, I didn't even blink. Team 7, Reed and Miller. It felt less like a random assignment and more like the universe finally getting tired of our subtle dancing and shoving us into a closet together. The closet was Cabin 6, a cedar-paneled box isolated at the edge of the property, surrounded by drifting snow and silence. It was equipped with 2 ergonomic chairs, a massive monitor, and a coffee machine that looked like it required a pilot's license. We set up in silence, the air vibrating with the unsaid things from the hallway. But the moment we opened our laptops, the tension shifted frequencies. We weren't arguing anymore. We were building. The challenge was to construct a predictive market algorithm that could handle extreme volatility. Essentially, to find order in chaos. It was fitting. For the first 2 hours, the only sounds were the aggressive clatter of mechanical keys and the hum of the server rack. We worked in a fugue state. Usually, pair programming is an exercise in frustration, 2 egos fighting for the cursor. This was different. This was a symphony. Olivia wrote the front-end architecture with a speed that was terrifying, her code clean, elegant, and ruthless. I followed, weaving security protocols into her structure, fortifying her speed with my resilience. We weren't just compatible. We were synchronous. Around midnight, the professional silence began to crack. You comment your code like you're writing a memoir, Olivia murmured, not looking away from the screen. Her voice was raspy with fatigue, a sound that did things to my pulse I couldn't debug. Every function has a paragraph of explanation. It's verbose. It's called documentation, Olivia, I shot back, leaning over to point at a line. My arm brushed hers, and the contact burned, but neither of us pulled away. I write it so the next person knows why I made the decision. You code like you expect to be the only one smart enough to read it." She turned, a smirk playing on her lips. "Usually, I am. Arrogance is a bug, not a feature. Confidence is an optimization strategy." We fell into a rhythm of teasing that was sharper than any touch. We were flirting in C++, using syntax as foreplay. It was heady. The isolation made the world disappear. No investors, no press releases, just the snow outside and the heat rising inside. By 3 a.m., the exhaustion stripped away her defenses. Her hair was coming loose, strands falling into her eyes. She was chewing her lip as she wrestled with a data migration issue. I stopped typing to watch her. I watched how she attacked the problem, discarding failures and pivoting to the solution. It was a display of pure, unadulterated competence. "You missed a bracket on line 402, I said softly. She groaned, rubbing her temples. "I hate that you're right. I was trying to force the loop." "You can't force it. You have to let it resolve." I turned my chair fully toward her. The blue light of the monitor reflected in her dark eyes, making them look like deep water. "You know, watching you work is terrifying. Your logic is lethal, Olivia. It cuts through everything unnecessary." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "It's incredibly attractive." The clicking stopped. The silence was absolute. Olivia took her hands off the keyboard and placed them in her lap. She turned to face me, and the look in her eyes wasn't the guarded calculation I was used to. It was wide open. "You aren't playing fair," she whispered. "I'm not playing at all." "I can't focus when you look at me like that," she admitted, her voice dropping to a hush. "You are a dangerous distraction. I'm trying to build a firewall, and you're rewriting the permissions just by sitting there. Maybe the firewall needs to come down." "If it comes down," she said, her gaze dropping to my lips. "I don't know what happens to the system." "Then let it crash," I challenged. She leaned in. The air was charged, feeling like ozone. The distance closed to inches. I could see the gold flecks in her irises. We were on the precipice of something irreversible. Then, with a sharp crack, the overhead lights died. The blackout was absolute, swallowing the cabin in a sudden, suffocating, heavy darkness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the howling of the wind against the cedar planks and the frantic, rhythmic thudding of my own heart. Then, the backup battery kicked in. The massive monitor flickered, stabilized, and cast a ghostly, low-voltage blue glow across the room. It didn't illuminate the corners. It only carved us out of the shadows, turning the space into a private, suspended capsule. Olivia hadn't moved. In the spectral light, her profile looked like it was cut from marble. Beautiful, rigid, and terrified. Her hands hovered uselessly over her keyboard, trembling slightly. The silence that followed the hum of the servers was deafening. A ringing void that made every breath sound like a shout. "The compile speed," she whispered, her voice brittle and uncharacteristically high. "The battery won't support the full compile. We're going to lose the deployment window. The latency will kill the demo." "Forget the window," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. I reached out, not to touch her, but to dim the monitor's brightness. The shadows rushed in closer, shrinking our world to a radius of 3 feet. "We have enough charge to keep the core active. Right now, the code isn't the problem." "The code is always the problem," she insisted, spinning her chair to face me. The leather creaked, a harsh sound in the quiet. "You don't understand. If we fail this sprint, the investors walk. If they walk, my Series B valuation collapses. If that collapses, the narrative shifts." "You're spiraling, Olivia. It's a power outage, not an apocalypse." "It's the same thing," she snapped. And then the fight drained out of her, leaving her slumped and exposed. If I collapse, I'm not just a failed founder. I'm a cautionary tale. See, we gave her the capital, and she couldn't handle the scale. If a guy fails, it's a learning pivot. If I fail, it's proof that we don't belong in the C-suite. I can't afford a glitch. The confession hung in the cold air, stripping away the last layers of her armor. I suddenly understood the tailored suits, the ruthless efficiency, the ice. It wasn't arrogance. It was a survival strategy. She had built a fortress because she was under constant, invisible siege. I slid my chair closer until our knees bumped. This time, she didn't flinch. She just looked at me, her eyes dark pools reflecting the blue screen. "That is a hell of a lot of weight to carry on one processor," I said softly. "I don't know how to put it down," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been optimizing for perfection for so long, I think I deleted the source files for being human." "I see the human," I told her. "I see her right now. She's scared, she's brilliant, and she's beautiful." The distance between us had vanished. We were huddled over the single glowing screen like it was a campfire in a frozen wasteland. The air was thick with the scent of her rain-washed perfume and the static charge of unspoken desire. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. "You see too much," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my mouth. "It's a security risk." "Then stop patching it," I challenged, leaning in until I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheek. "Stop calculating the risk assessment for 5 minutes. Stop worrying about the investors, the press, the narrative. What do you want, Olivia? Not the CEO, you." She swallowed hard, searching my face with desperate intensity. "I want to stop thinking," she breathed. "I want to turn off the logic." "Then do it." "I don't know if I can." "I'll help you." I moved my hand, letting it hover near her face, close enough to feel the electricity, but not touching. "Break the rules, Olivia. Just once." She leaned into the space between us, her eyes fluttering shut. "I want to," she whispered, the admission raw. "God, I want to break every single one." The moment was suspended, a fragile bubble of potential energy, millimeters from collision. Then, with a deafening clack, the overhead lights blazed back to life. The transition from the intimate, hushed darkness of Cabin 6 to the sterile, blinding glare of the main stage felt like atmospheric re-entry. It burned. We were standing on a raised platform in the lodge's main auditorium, facing a panel of 5 judges who controlled enough capital to buy a small country. Behind them, the audience of our peers, the other founders, the rivals, the sharks, sat in shadowed judgment. Usually, this is the moment where I freeze. The imposter syndrome kicks in, whispering that my hoodie doesn't fit, my accent is too flat, and my degree is from the wrong zip code. But today, standing next to Olivia, the fear didn't have any oxygen to burn. We plugged in the laptop. The screen behind us flared to life, displaying the interface we had built in the dark. It was a hybrid monster, her elegant, frictionless front end fused perfectly with my paranoid, ironclad security protocols. It shouldn't have worked. It should have been a clunky Frankenstein of conflicting philosophies. Instead, it was beautiful. "Gentlemen," Olivia began, her voice projecting that cool, terrifying authority. "What you are looking at isn't just a market predictor. It's a vault that thinks." She moved to the left side of the stage. I moved to the right. We didn't look at each other, but I could feel her location in the room like a gravitational pull. We presented the demo not as 2 CEOs forced to collaborate, but as a single dual-core processor. When she paused for breath, I picked up the thread of the logic instantly. When I laid out the threat matrix, she stepped in to explain the user benefit before the judges could even frown. It was a dance, a high-stakes technical tango performed in front of the people who wanted us to fail. The audience went quiet. They weren't checking their phones anymore. They were watching the chemistry. It was palpable, electric, and undeniable. We moved like two parts of the same engine, firing in a sequence that had been calibrated in the silence of a snowbound cabin. Then came the Q&A. The center judge, a silver-haired titan named Sterling, who was known for making founders cry, leaned into his microphone. He didn't look at Olivia. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my outfit with thinly veiled disdain. "It's an impressive interface," Sterling said, his voice bored. "But the security architecture feels heavy. It's distinctly Rust Belt. You're building blast doors for a grocery store. It feels like you're letting your personal background dictate the product strategy. Is this level of paranoia actually scalable, or is it just a trauma response?" The room went deadly silent. It was a cheap shot, designed to remind everyone that I didn't belong. Heat rushed to my face. I opened my mouth to defend my code, to fight for my place as I always had, but I didn't get the chance. "It isn't paranoia," Olivia's voice cut through the room like a diamond saw. "It is foresight." She stepped forward, placing herself physically between me and the judge's line of sight. It was a subtle movement, but the symbolism was screaming. "You call it heavy because you are used to flimsy software built by people who have never lost anything," Olivia continued, her tone ferocious and elegant. "My partner didn't build blast doors. She built a foundation that can survive the volatility we all know is coming. Her architecture is the only reason my interface can run at this speed without crashing. If you think resilience is a trauma response, then you haven't been paying attention to the market." She turned to look at me then, on stage, in front of everyone. There was no calculation in her eyes, just fierce, unyielding loyalty. "She is the strongest engineer in this room," Olivia declared, turning back to the judges. "And this product is scalable precisely because she built it." I stood there, stunned. The venture capital darling had just used her political capital to shield the underdog. In that moment, the adrenaline of the pitch mixed with something far more potent. This wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a partnership. When the judges announced us as the winners, the room erupted. But as we walked off stage, the applause sounded distant. The only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the echo of Olivia calling me her partner. We hadn't just won the funding. We had rewritten the terms of engagement. The victory party was a sensory overload of high-end champagne and aggressive congratulations. The bass from the DJ booth thumped against the glass walls, vibrating in my chest. But the real noise was the static still crackling between Olivia and me. We accepted the toasts, we smiled for the photos, holding the giant novelty check like a shared shield, playing the part of the gracious victors perfectly. But every time our eyes met across the rim of a crystal flute, the room tilted on its axis. The air between us was too thick, too charged with the adrenaline of the win and the memory of the dark cabin. "It's too loud," Olivia murmured, leaning close to my ear. Her breath was warm against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the venue's aggressive air conditioning. "Balcony," I suggested, nodding toward the sliding doors. "North side. It's empty." We slipped away like rogue code escaping a sandbox environment. The balcony was silent, bathed in the silver light of the moon reflecting off the Sierra snow. The air was biting cold, a sharp, cleansing contrast to the humid, suffocating heat of the party inside. Olivia walked to the railing, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. She looked out at the jagged silhouette of the mountains, her breath clouding in the freezing air. "We did it," she said softly, the words floating away into the night. "We actually pulled it off." Sterling looked like he swallowed a lemon. "You were incredible up there," I said, moving to stand beside her, close enough to block the wind, but careful not to touch. "Defending me against him? That wasn't in the script, Olivia." She turned to face me, her expression serious, stripped of the boardroom armor. "The script was wrong. I was correcting the data. I looked at her. Really, truly looked at her, illuminated by the moonlight. She looked beautiful, terrifyingly intelligent, and for the first time, accessible. "Olivia," I started, my voice steady despite the frantic racing of my heart. "I need to ask you something. Back in the glass pod, when I touched your hand..." She went still, her eyes locking onto mine. "I know. You didn't pull away. Not at first." "No," she whispered, the admission hanging heavy in the cold air. "I didn't." "Why?" She let out a long breath. She looked down at her hands, the hands that controlled millions in capital, then back up at me with a gaze that was completely unflinching. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't want to calculate the outcome. I just wanted to feel the input. She took a step closer, invading my personal space with a deliberate, predatory grace that made my mouth go dry. "It shook me," she confessed, her voice dropping to that sultry register. "Because I realized I don't want to be your rival anymore. It's an inefficient use of resources." "Inefficient," I laughed, a low, breathless sound that was half nerves, half desire. "Is that what we're calling this tension?" "I'm calling it a missed opportunity for synergy," she teased, but her eyes were dark with intent. "You challenge me, Miller. You make me sharper. You make me reckless. I like it." "I make you reckless?" I stepped closer, closing the final gap until the fabric of our coats brushed. "That sounds dangerous for a CEO." "Maybe I'm done playing it safe," she murmured. Her gaze dropped to my lips, heavy and expectant, before snapping back to my eyes. "Maybe I want to see what happens when we merge the repositories." The metaphor hung between us, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was an explicit confirmation of the voltage that had been humming under the surface for days. "That's a complex integration," I warned, my voice dropping to a whisper. "It requires full transparency. No firewalls, no hidden directories." "I'm willing to open the source code if you are," she replied. I reached out, taking her hand. This time, there was no hesitation, no glitch. Her fingers laced through mine, her grip strong and sure. The heat of her skin burned through the cold night air, grounding me instantly. The cold was biting, but the heat radiating from her was enough to keep me standing there for hours. "We're going back to the city tomorrow," I said. "Back to the real world, back to separate HQs." "San Francisco isn't that big," Olivia countered, her thumb tracing the back of my hand. "And I have a very flexible schedule for high-priority meetings." "Is this a high-priority meeting?" "The highest," she confirmed. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. We stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold air and the scent of each other, balanced on the edge of something vast and uncharted. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was definitely a promise. A promise that the rivalry was over and something much more interesting was about to begin. We finally walked back inside, side by side. Not touching, but the tether between us was palpable. The noise of the party washed over us, but it didn't matter. We weren't just two founders fighting for scraps anymore. We were partners in a game nobody else even knew we were playing. The door clicked shut behind us. If you want to see where this flame goes next, hit subscribe. The merger is only just beginning.